Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Sarvat Rasool and our today's session is on our first novel that we would study in this course, that is Joseph Andrews, and we would cover some chapters from book 1, that is chapters 1 to 10. We would look at the story, text, and we would do some critical analysis. Before we move forward, I would like to share the previous session's main points. In the previous session, I gave you an introduction to Henry Fielding, who is the author of Joseph Andrews. I discussed with you important points related to his birth, his early life circumstances, his education, his career, etc. Then I talked to you about Fielding's response to Pamela. If you remember, Pamela was a work that was written by Richardson, and this work was criticized by Fielding. However, despite this criticism, Pamela has a strong influence on what Fielding has written. Also because Fielding was under financial pressure and was in financial crisis at that time, so he thought of writing a parody of Pamela. We also talked about some tragic aspects of Fielding's life that had a strong influence in making him choices other than as playwright, which changed the course of his career. He moved to law and then he started working as a journalist as well. And finally, he wrote novels. We also traced the influence of Richardson, his writing style and construction of plot as he has followed in Pamela, and how this plot and structure has affected the plot and structure of Joseph Andrews. Since that was my first session on the novel Joseph Andrews, so I gave you detailed introduction to the important characters and a brief introduction to the minor characters, so that when you go through the novel, it's easy for you to understand all. I also introduced you some major themes. The last thing that I shared in the previous session was introduction to the preface. I not only shared some parts of the text from the preface, but also I tried to explain to you what was the reason of giving the preface and how by giving the preface actually Fielding tried to justify his work and to explain to the readers what kind of work he was going to produce. As far as the current session is concerned, in this session we would mainly cover some part of book 1. Well, at the outset I would like to share that the whole novel is divided into parts or books. So by book, what I mean is a part. Since the term book is used, so I would also use the same. In the session that we have today, I would cover chapters 1 to 10 from the first book. What we would do is we would look at the headings of these chapters and would discuss their significance. I would share with you brief summaries of each chapter. While we would be going through each of the chapter's summary, I would raise some important points of discussion and would share with you how certain themes, how certain characters, and how plot is developed with the help of that particular chapter. More importantly, I would say some important parts of text with reference to themes, development of characters, etc. would be read and would be discussed. At this point, I would like to remind you again that since novel is a thick piece of work, it is not possible to go through each and every word of the text here in these sessions, so you would have to read the text independently. However, I would try to incorporate as much of text as possible to give you a clear understanding of how you can interpret and analyze the text. With this we come to book 1, chapter 1. In this chapter, Fielding justifies the moral agenda of his novel at the outset, and he tells us that examples are often better teachers than precepts, and thus he defends the practice of biography, claiming that such books communicate valuable patterns of virtue to a wide public. He lists several biographies, including those of Colley Cibber and Pamela Andrews, as examples of male virtue and female chastity. Fielding reinforces his opening argument and introduces his own work by remarking that it was by keeping his sister's excellent example of virtue before him that Joseph Andrews was able to preserve his own purity. So now let us look at the opening text of chapter 1. ये बिल्कुल शुरू जहाँ से हो रहा है वो 2 पैराग्राफ्स मैंने उठाए हैं that I am going to share with you. How does Fielding write? Well, he says, it is a trite but true observation that examples work more forcibly on the mind than precepts. And if this be just in what is odious and blamable, it is more strongly so in what is amiable and praiseworthy. तो क्या कहता है Fielding? कि एग्जाम्पल्स देने से बात ज़्यादा समझ आती है, इसलिए he would like to give examples. Here, emulation most effectually operates upon us and inspires our imitation in an irresistible manner. A good man, therefore, is a standing lesson to all his acquaintance and of far greater use in that narrow circle than a good book. तो बेसिकली वो कहता है कि प्रीच करने की बजाय if एक प्रैक्टिकल एग्जाम्पल दी जाए, a good man if a good man is present as an example in front of people, he would create more effect and influence on people than a good book. But as it often happens that the best men are but little known and consequently cannot extend the usefulness of their examples a great way, the writer may be called in aid to spread their history farther and to present the amiable pictures to those who have not the happiness of knowing the originals. And so, by communicating such valuable patterns to the world, he, that is the writer, may perhaps do a more extensive service to mankind than the person whose life originally offered the pattern. So what Fielding believes in is that the practical example of a good man is far better than a book. However, because the practical examples of good men are very little, that is बहुत कम होती हैं, and then they are not shared much, लोगों को उनके बारे में इतना पता ही नहीं चलता, so people cannot take inspiration from them. In that case, he says that if a writer documents, if a writer writes about a good man, अगर एक writer किसी अच्छे शख्स की कहानी लिखता है, उसके बारे में बातों को लिखता है, then these writings can be spread and these writings can provide an opportunity to carry the message forward and to enable a bigger number of people to take benefit by looking at the example of that good man. So at the outset of his first chapter of book 1, he again has given a kind of justification of why he is writing about certain characters. Well, in the last paragraph of chapter 1, if you look at the text, again I am quoting some text here for you. आप अपनी उसमें novels की copies में देख सकते हैं. He says, what the female readers are taught by the memories of Mrs. Andrews is so well set forth in the excellent essays or letters prefixed to the second and subsequent editions of that work that it would be here a needless repetition. The authentic history with which I now present the public is an instance of the great good that book is likely to do, and of the prevalence of example which I have just observed, since it will appear that it was by keeping the excellent patterns of his sister's virtue before his eyes that Mr. Joseph Andrews was chiefly enabled to preserve his purity in the midst of such great temptations. So what he says is that in Pamela, remember the work that was written by Richardson's, Pamela Andrews, who is supposedly the sister of Joseph Andrews, was presented And she took care of and she protected her chastity throughout the novel and stood as a good example for the female readers. Now, what Fielding says is that he is moving one step ahead and he is presenting the example of her brother, that is Joseph Andrews, who is the hero of this novel. And he says, I shall only add that this character of male chastity, though doubtless as desirable and becoming in one part of the human species as in the other, is almost the only virtue which the great apologist hath not given himself for the sake of giving the example to his readers. So, before I move on to chapter 2, I would say that in chapter 1, Fielding has justified what kind of characters he is going to introduce and why he is going to talk about the goodness of those characters, because he wants to set an example for the readers. He has also given a reference to Pamela, and he has linked up Joseph Andrews to Pamela as a brother. This provides a kind of underpinning to the further development of characters in the novel. Okay, now I bring you to chapter 2 of book 1. If you look at the text, अगर आप अपने novel के text को खोलें, I hope आपने novel की या तो copies, hard copies खरीद ली होंगी, और आप बहुत सारे free online copies available हैं, वहाँ से अपने लिए you can download. So if you open chapter 2, you would see उसके ऊपर एक heading दी हुई है, एक टेक्स्ट लिखा हुआ है बोल्ड फॉर्म में. What is that? The text says, of Mr. Joseph Andrews, his birth, parentage, education and great endowments, with a word or two concerning ancestors. So basically what Fielding has done is कि उसने chapter के ऊपर he has provided a kind of heading that is actually a small summary of what the chapter is about. So, by reading this heading or by reading this text, we come to know that this chapter is about Mr. Joseph Andrews, his birth, about his parents, his early education, and giving us some other aspects of his background. Now, what I want to say is that Fielding has used these headings as a technique. And very cleverly and very carefully he has used these headings to prepare the reader to understand what is told within the chapter. If you remember, these are the times when novel as a genre in English is taking birth and is being established. In these times when there is no precedence, when there is no example of this kind of writing before it, not only that it is difficult for Fielding to write it, but also it is difficult for the reader to understand it. So, to facilitate the readers, Fielding has used this kind of structure, that at the top of each and every chapter he has given a heading. The heading actually indicates or summarizes what the chapter is about. As we would go through different chapters, I would keep on sharing with you the headings of those chapters as well. As far as the summary of chapter 2 is concerned, Fielding introduces Mr. Joseph Andrews, who is the hero of our ensuing history, that is the novel Joseph Andrews. Joy, as he is called, and as Fielding as his character is called the hero at this stage of the narrative, जब अभी वो छोटा है, comparatively he is young. He is the son of the low-born Mr. and Mrs. Andrews and the brother of Pamela Andrews. That is the fictive heroine of Samuel Richardson's famous novel. Fielding confesses that despite his best genealogical efforts, he has been unable to discover the ancestry of the Andrews family. और फील्डिंग ने मजीद कोई डिटेल्स नहीं दी हैं ऑफ द फैमिली ऑफ एंड्रयूज, एंड अबाउट दैट ही कन्फेसेस दैट ही कुड नॉट ट्रेस ऑल दीज. Now you as a reader need to understand that again it is used as a technique by Fielding, who has used it as a mature writer, how something that is fictitious, something that is not reality, he is presenting it in such a way that it sounds and it appears to be reality. With this, we come to the opening text of Book 1, Chapter 2. The text runs like this. Mr. Joseph Andrews, the hero of our ensuing history, was esteemed to be the only son of Gaffer and Gammer Andrews, and brother to the illustrious Pamela, whose virtue is at present so famous. As to his ancestors, we have searched with great diligence, but little success, being unable to trace them farther than his great-grandfather, who as an elderly person in the parish remembers to have heard his father say, was an excellent cudgel player. So this much is what we are told about Joseph's ancestry. Here we continue with the opening text of Book 1, Chapter 2, where Fielding writes, whether he had any ancestors before this, we must leave to the opinion of our curious reader, finding nothing of sufficient certainty to rely on. However, we cannot omit inserting an epitaph which an ingenious friend of ours hath communicated. Stay, traveller, for underneath this pew lies fast asleep that merry man Andrew. When the last day's great sun shall gild the skies, then he shall from his tomb get up and rise. Be merry while thou canst, for surely thou shalt shortly be as sad as he is now. The words are almost out of the stone with antiquity. But it is needless to observe that Andrew here is writ without an S and is besides a Christian name. My friend, moreover, conjectures this to have been the founder of that sect of laughing philosophers since called Merry Andrews. So actually Fielding makes fun of it as well, but he provides the reader with the maximum information available as such for the fictitious hero Joseph Andrews' ancestry. Again we continue with the text. Fielding writes, to waive therefore a circumstance which, though mentioned in conformity to the exact rules of biography, is not generally greatly material, I proceed to things of more consequence. Indeed, it is sufficiently certain that he had as many ancestors as the best man living, and perhaps if we look 500 or 600 years backwards, might be related to some persons of very great figure at present, whose ancestors within half the last century are buried in as great obscurity. But suppose for argument's sake we should admit that he had no ancestors at all, but had sprung up, according to the modern phrase, out of a dunghill, as the Athenians pretended they themselves did from the earth, would not this Autocopros have been justly entitled to all the praise arising from his own virtues? So mainly what Fielding says is that it is the character, it is the qualities, it is the virtue, it is the goodness of a character that matters, and it is not the ancestry, or it is not the great ancestors or forefathers that really matter. So what he says is that let us suppose that Joseph Andrews just sprung up and he was not as such born as a child to the family that had ancestry. Even in that case it doesn't make any difference, because what makes the difference is that he is virtuous, and his own virtues are more important than his forefathers, their deeds and their position in the society. With this we move on to Chapter 3 of Book 1, and the heading of Book 1, Chapter 3 says, the text is, of Mr. Abraham Adams the curate, Mrs. Slipslop the chambermaid, and others. So just by looking at this heading we can come to know that we are introduced to the clergyman Abraham Adams, to Mrs. Slipslop, who is the chambermaid, and some other characters. And here is the opening text of Book 1, Chapter 3. Fielding writes, Mr. Abraham Adams was an excellent scholar. He was a perfect master of the Greek and Latin languages, to which he added a great share of knowledge in the Oriental tongues and could read and translate French, Italian and Spanish. He had applied many years to the most severe study and had treasured up a fund of learning rarely to be met within a university. He was besides a man of good sense, good parts and good nature, but was at the same time as entirely ignorant of the ways of this world as an infant just entered into could possibly be. So, Parson Adams is introduced as a character who is very good, who has a good sense of everything, who is good-natured, who is physically fine, but then there is a problem with what? There is a problem with his inability to understand the ways of the world. He was so good-natured that Fielding says about him, as he had never any intention to deceive, so he never suspected such a design in others. He was generous, friendly and brave to an excess, but simplicity was his characteristic. He did no more than Mr. Colley Cyber apprehended, and any such passions as malice and envy, as malice and envy to exist in mankind, which was indeed less remarkable in a country person than in a gentleman who had passed his life behind the scenes. A place which had been seldom thought the school of innocence, and where a very little observation would have convinced the great apologists that those passions have a real existence in the human mind. Well, in this text we see Fielding, who in a very light-hearted manner, who makes fun of the simplicity of Parson Adams as well. But we also notice that in this opening text of chapter 3, Parson Adams is introduced as a strongly positive and good character as well. Well, we continue with the text of book 1, chapter 3, and the text runs as this. His virtue and his other qualifications, as they rendered him equal to his office, so they made him an agreeable and valuable companion, and had so much endeared and well recommended him to a bishop, that at the age of 50 he was provided with a handsome income of £23 a year, which however he could not make any great figure with, because he lived in a dear country and was a little encumbered with a wife and 6 children. Well, here Fielding is making fun of how the social setups put clergymen or people under pressure, the kind of pay he would get and the pressure of financially supporting a wife and 6 children, all with reference to Adams, is mentioned in a very, very light-hearted way. Well, overall I would say that chapter 2 and chapter 3 shed light on some important aspects of the life of Joseph Andrews, the hero, of the life of Parson Adams and some other characters. So the important points related to chapter 2 and 3 overall, I would say, are that when Joseph Andrews was 10 years of age, he served as a bird keeper and whipper-in of the pack of hounds of Sir Thomas Booby. Do you remember Thomas Booby and Lady Booby? Sir Thomas Booby is introduced as a lord, and young Joey, or Joseph Andrews, used to work at his place when he was of 10 years only. Unfortunately, however, he was soon removed to the stables because the sweetness of his voice, instead of scaring the birds and controlling the dogs, attracted them both. अब उसको इस ड्यूटी से हटा के स्टेबल में घोड़ों के साथ ड्यूटी पे इसलिए लगा दिया गया because he had such a sweet voice that it would not scare the birds to go away or the dogs to go away, rather it would attract them to come closer. His success and honesty in racing Sir Thomas's horses brought joy to the notice of Lady Booby, whose attendant he became at the age of 17. So by the age of 17, he became an attendant of Lady Booby. One of his duties was to bear the lady's prayer book to church, and there his fine singing drew the attention of the curate, Mr. Abraham Adams. So through these chapters you clearly come to know how Fielding is establishing the background links of all these characters. Who was Joseph, where he was working, how he came across Lady Booby, how as he went to the church carrying the prayer book of Lady Booby, he, because of the sweetness of his voice, was noticed by Parson Adams, who later on plays a very important role in Joseph's life. Adams is not only an excellent scholar, but a man of good sense, good parts and good nature, as I said earlier. However, at the same time, he is naive and his economic position is encumbered by a wife and 6 children. Adam questions Joy and is so impressed by his wide reading and his diligence that he decides to approach Lady Booby about teaching the boy Latin. Since Latin was the language of scholarly pursuits at that time, so Adams, because he was impressed by the intelligence of the boy and by his wide reading, he thought that he would approach Lady Booby so that he is allowed to teach Latin to this bright boy. As Lady Booby looks on Adams as a kind of domestic, his only means of access to her is through her waiting gentlewoman, Mrs. Slipslop. So this is how we are introduced to the character of Mrs. Slipslop, who is a maid or a waiting woman at Lady Booby's place. As he learns that Joy will soon be taken to London by Lady Booby, so this is the place there when he goes to Mrs. Slipslop so that he could meet Lady Booby, that he is told by Slipslop that soon Joseph Andrews, or Joy as he is called, would be taken to London by Lady Booby. Well, dear students, some important points of discussion related to these chapters are following. Number 1, you need to notice the mocking style in which Fielding treats the sacred data of biography, especially in the first and then the second chapter. It shows that he wants to move straight to the heart of the matter. Joy's virtues are more important than his ancestors, as I said earlier. He is described as being attractive, able and honest. He is important. It is also important to notice that at the same time he is fearless. Even he can manage the most spirited horses easily, which is an indication of his self-control, discipline and activeness. So we are introduced to the characteristics or the qualities of Joseph Andrews. Adams is impressed by Joy's innocence and industry, and these qualities, along with the childlike simplicity of the parson, contrast with the way Sir Thomas judges men by their dress or fortune, and with the kind of vanity that Mrs. Slipslop has, and in her torturous speeches that she reflects that, which leaves the straightforward Adams completely befuddled. अभी जब आप आगे पढ़ेंगे, you would see how Mrs. Slipslop uses language that is in her pretension, where she wants to pretend herself to be very learned. She uses confidently the words of English that are comparatively difficult, and she uses all of them in an incorrect way. Most of the times she changes their pronunciation, and actually most of the times she completely changes the words and they cannot be identified as the words of English language. As for Lady Booby, she is vain enough to speak of Adams as a kind of domestic only and her country neighbors as the brutes. So a woman who would use this kind of language for people around, we can very well understand her nature and her character. Well, dear students, as I said earlier in the previous session when I was introducing you to important characters, that Mrs. Slipslop is an important character who plays a very important role in the novel, and through her interaction with Lady Booby and with Joseph Andrews, and her advances towards Joseph Andrews enable Fielding to present the theme of chastity. So it is appropriate to notice what Fielding says about Mrs. Slipslop. That is why from chapter 3, book 1, I have quoted here some text that is about Mrs. Slipslop. You also need to notice the name of Mrs. Slipslop. The names Mrs. Slipslop, Parson Adams, Joseph Andrews, each of the names, even Lady Booby, each of the names gives clues to the type of character. Joseph, जो हमारे यहाँ हम हज़रत यूसुफ अलैहिस्सलाम को रेफर करते हैं. In Christianity, Joseph is the name that is used for Hazrat Yusuf alayhi salam. So if he is named after Joseph, it means the concept of chastity that was related to Joseph the prophet is to be reflected or mirrored in his personality. On the other hand, you can look at the character of Slipslop, who would have a lot of tongue slips, who would say things that would not make any sense, also reflects her character. By the way, what Fielding says about her is as follows. Mrs. Slipslop, the waiting gentlewoman, being herself the daughter of a curate, preserved some respect for Adams. She professed great regard for his learning and would frequently dispute with him on points of theology, but always insisted on a deference to be paid to her understanding, as she had been frequently at London and knew more of the world than a country parson could pretend to. So we can notice how vain she is. This vanity, ये जो गुरूर है उसका, this is one of the causes of evils and a source of ridicule, as well as Fielding has mentioned in the preface. She had in these disputes a particular advantage over Adams. And what is that advantage? For she was a mighty affecter of hard words, which she used in such a manner that the parson, who durst not offend her by calling her words in question, was frequently at some loss to guess her meaning, and would have been much less puzzled by an Arabian manuscript. The strange language that he would use, the kind of words that he would use, Parson Adam would not be able to understand them, but he did not have the courage to question this kind of vocabulary or this use of words. Continuing the text from chapter 3 about Mrs. Slipslops, I would say that Fielding writes, "La, Mr. Adams," said Mrs. Slipslop, "do you think my lady will suffer any preambles about any such matters?" अब नोटिस करें preambles का यूज बिल्कुल गलत हुआ है. She is going to London very concisely and I am confidious. I am confident actually वो कहना चाहती है, लेकिन गलत इंग्लिश यूज कर रही है. I am confidious, would not leave joy behind her on any account, for he is one of the genteelest young fellows you may see in a summer's day. And I am confidious, फिर वही गलत word यूज कर रही है. And I am confidious she would as soon think of parting with a pair of her grey mares, for she values herself as much on one as the other. Adams would have interrupted, but she proceeded. अब वो बात तो सुनती नहीं थी. Adams को, Parson Adams would try to stop her, but she would continue. And why is Latin more necessitous, that is necessary, she wants to say, for a footman than a gentleman? It is very proper that you clergymen must learn it, because you can't preach without it. But I have heard gentlemen say in London that it is fit for nobody else. I am confidious my lady would be angry with me for mentioning it, and I shall draw myself into no such dilemma, actually she wants to say, at which words her lady's bell rung and Mr. Adams was forced to retire. Nor could he gain a second opportunity with her before the London journey, which happened a few days afterwards. So Parson Adams did not get a chance to meet Lady Booby and to be able to convince her that Parson Adams should be allowed to teach Joseph Latin. Rather, before that, Lady Booby, taking Joseph Andrews along with her, took journey to London. Dear students, with this we move on to the next chapter, that is chapter 4 of book 1. And the heading of this chapter, by the way, says, what happened after their journey to London? So the heading itself gives us clues about what the chapter is going to tell us. Here is the summary of chapter 4. Chapter 4 tells us that in London, Joy falls under the influence of the big city footmen who succeed in getting him to change his haircut, but fail to make him pick up any of other vices. He spends most of his free time on music, about which subject he becomes very learned. He becomes less obviously devoted to his religion, but his morals remained entirely uncorrupted. Now here we can notice Fielding as a critic of the religious practices of the times as well, and Fielding as a moralist as well. Because what he says is that outwardly Joseph Andrews changed when he started living in London. However, inwardly he was still free from all the corruption or all the vices. And though it seemed that apparently he was less devoted to religion, but actually his morals still remained uncorrupted. Again, the point that Fielding wants to emphasize is that the Christian doctrine is not that important to him as is the active morality or the practice of morality itself. Lady Booby begins to find him more attractive than ever. Her familiarities with Joy become the subject of drawing room gossip, as Lady Tittle and Lady Tattle play a vital role in spreading that. So the other women, the kind of women Lady Booby would have as friends who are also like her, they would have drawing room gossip, and Lady Tittle and Lady Tattle are actually again representative characters of all these gossip women, or these women who would indulge in loose talk about different affairs. However, Joseph remains essentially unaffected. If he was outwardly a pretty fellow, his morals remained entirely uncorrupted. Here I quote some text from this chapter, that is chapter 4. The text runs as, "If he was outwardly a pretty fellow, his morals remained entirely uncorrupted, though he was at the same time smarter and genteeler than any of the beaux in town, either in or out of livery." So nobody, be in the uniform or not, would be able to look smarter or more handsome than Joseph Andrews. This was the effect of the city life as he started living in London. However, the positive aspect of this, that was an additional advantage to all this situation, was that morally he was very strong even now. Some important discussion points with relevance to this chapter are that the hints given about town life in chapter 3 are now expanded. London becomes the center of intrigue and affectation, in contrast to the country life from where Joseph Andrews has come. London is a place where there is much affectation everywhere. In the same way that the trials and tribulations of this world affect Parson Adams only temporarily. So, in some ways, the characters, be it Joseph Andrews or Parson Adams, they are affected by the worldly effects. So Joseph Andrews, even though only outwardly, but he is affected by the superficial life of London. Dear students, another important female character in the novel is that of Lady Booby. It is through the character of Lady Booby, who makes advances towards Joseph and who tries to seduce Joseph, that Fielding has presented the theme of chastity, and has also portrayed all the affectation that was prevailing in the society in London. So it is appropriate to read some text that gives us some exposure to the kind of character Lady Booby is. Here is a selected part of text from chapter 4, book 1. The text runs as, "His lady, who had often said of him that Joy was the handsomest and genteelest footman in the kingdom, but that it was pity he wanted spirit, began now to find that fault no longer. On the contrary, she was frequently heard to cry out, "Hey, there is some life in this fellow." तो पहले वो जो कहा करती थी लेडी बूबी that he is very handsome and very smart but he lacks spirit. Now the change that has come in Joseph's personality because of his stay in London, she notices that there is some life in this fellow. She plainly saw the effects which the town air hath on the soberest constitutions. She would now walk out with him into Hyde Park in the morning, and when tired, which happened almost every minute, would lean on his arm and converse with him in great familiarity. In a very light-hearted, light tone, Fielding has made fun of the activities of Lady Booby. Whenever she stepped out of her coach, जैसे मैंने शुरू में कहा था, dear students, that a lot of spellings and vocabulary of old times is found in the text. So you can see stepped, that is stepped out of her coach. She would take him by the hand and sometimes, for the fear of stumbling, press it very hard. She admitted him to deliver messages at her bedside in the morning, leered at him at table, and indulged him in all those innocent freedoms which women of figure may permit without the least sully of their virtue. Through the last sentence, you can also notice how Fielding is making fun of the pretentious women from the upper class. With this, we move on to the summary of chapter 5. The death of Sir Thomas Booby confines Lady Booby to her house for a period of mourning, but she soon begins to pursue Joseph. Calling him to her bedside, she cunningly tries to arouse his passions but fails. She cannot understand Joseph's innocence and his failure to understand her. When Lady Booby pretends to worry whether it is safe for her to be alone in her bedroom with Joy, he vows that he would rather die 1,000 deaths than committing any sexual transgression. Lady Booby finally dismisses him in frustration. Joseph, somewhat perturbed, writes a letter to his sister. Remember, Pamela is the sister of Joseph Andrews. He thinks that Lady Booby is perhaps pursuing him, but charitably ascribes this to distraction over the death of Sir Thomas. In any case, he anticipates his dismissal and advises Pamela of his return to the Booby country seat. After sealing the letter, he runs into Mrs. Slipslop, so he goes to Mrs. Slipslop, who has long nursed a secret passion for Joseph. Now Mrs. Slipslop is also interested in Joseph. Provoked by Joseph's inability to understand her advances, she is about to seize her prey when her mistress's bell rings, and Joseph is temporarily saved. Fielding actually drawing the reader's attention to the different manifestations of love in Lady Booby and Mrs. Slipslop returns the reader to the vacillations of Lady Booby, now pouting. By this time, Mrs. Slipslop is also piqued at Joseph and vilifies his character, even claiming that Betty the chambermaid is with child by him. Lady Booby orders Slipslop to discharge them both, and Slipslop, realizing that he has gone too far, tries to backtrack. But it is too late. Yet Lady Booby, warmed by the same passion for Joseph as is Slipslop, countermands her orders several times, and finally she resolves to see Joseph and to insult him before discarding him. This chapter closes with our atmosphere from Fielding to love's deceiving power of metamorphosis. What Fielding conveys through this chapter is the negative power of love when it becomes lust, and how it is depicted through the characters of Lady Booby and Slipslop, who have affectation that is main theme, not only the main theme of the novel, but also that is a major source of ridiculous. By the way, it is also important to notice the heading of chapter 5 that says, "The death of Sir Thomas Booby, with the affectionate and mournful behavior of his widow and the great purity of Joseph Andrews. So actually through the heading, Fielding has already given clues to what happens in the chapter. In order to help you understand about the character of Lady Booby and about the advances of Lady Booby, this is an important part from the text of chapter 5, book 1. The text runs as following. During the first 6 days, the poor lady admitted none but Mrs. Slipslop and 3 female friends who made a party at cards. Now that her husband has died and she is just retiring in her room and pretending to be grieved, actually she just calls her female friends to have a party at cards. This is how Fielding ridicules the affectation that is present in the characters of upper class. But on the 7th day she ordered Joey, whom for a good reason we shall hereafter call Joseph, to bring up her tea kettle. The lady, being in bed, called Joseph to her, bade him sit down, and having accidentally laid her hand on his, she asked him if he had ever been in love. Joseph answered with some confusion, it was time enough for one so young as himself to think on such things. As young as you are, replied the lady, I am convinced you are no stranger to that passion. Come, Joy, says she, tell me truly, who is the happy girl whose eyes have made a conquest of you? Joseph returned that all the women he had ever seen were equally indifferent to him. Oh, then, said the lady, you are a general lover. So actually what Lady Booby is trying to do is just to persuade Joseph, and she is not ready to be convinced. She actually cannot understand that a young boy like Joseph can believe in chastity and can have a character that is very, very strong morally. Dear students, here is the concluding text of chapter 5. I don't understand you, madam, says Joseph. Don't you, said she. Then you are either a fool or pretend to be so. I find I was mistaken in you. So get you downstairs and never let me see your face again. Your pretended innocence cannot impose on me. Madam, said Joseph, I would not have your ladyship think any evil of me. I have always endeavoured to be a dutiful servant both to you and my master. O thou villain, answered my lady, why didst thou mention the name of that dear man unless to torment me, to bring his precious memory to my mind? And then she bursts into a fit of tears. And we can notice, of course, as readers, that this is all pretension. Get thee from my sight. Thee means you. Ye purane wali English hai. Get thee from my sight. I shall never endure thee more. I will not endure you any more. At which words she turned away from him, and Joseph retreated from the room in a most disconsolate condition and wrote that letter which the reader will find in the next chapter. Abhi, what you need to notice is that Fielding has closed the chapter by giving a clue that Joseph would write a letter to his sister Pamela. And Fielding has also shared that the reader will find this letter in the next chapter. So actually he is preparing the reader for what is coming up in the next chapter. With this we come to chapter 6. Chapter 6 is mainly about the letter that he writes to his sister. We since already know what happened in chapter 5, so all that is narrated in chapter 6 to Pamela. As far as chapter 7 is concerned, the heading of chapter 7 says, Sayings of Wise Men, a dialogue between the lady and her maid, and a panegyric or rather satire on the passion of love in the sublime light. Now the heading of chapter 7 clearly tells that Fielding as a moralist is again commenting on the passion of love, and he is talking how the upper class people fall victims to this. Joseph writes the letter to Pamela As I said earlier, Joseph writes a letter to his sister Pamela reporting on the strange behavior of Lady Booby since the death of Sir Thomas. He thinks that it is because of grief over the loss of her husband, despite the fact that he always thought that they did not like each other. He then recounts the incident in Lady Booby's bedroom, remarking that if it had not been so great a lady, I should have thought she had had a mind to me. He anticipates losing his place soon because of this falling out, and in any case he does not wish to remain in her employ if she is going to continue to be psychologically unstable. So mainly what Fielding is doing is that through chapter 6 he is preparing us to see how Joseph would leave this job and would continue on his journey back. After finishing this letter, Joseph walks downstairs and meets Mrs. Slipslop, who has tried in the past to entice him with tea, sweetmeats, wine and many other delicacies. She now makes another effort. However, Joseph is saved as Lady Booby again rings the bell to call Mrs. Slipslop. Anyhow, this is the note where chapter 6 comes to an end, and as I have earlier said that in chapter 7 we would come across Fielding as a moralist. So let's see the opening of chapter 7 and the text. As a moralist, Fielding writes, "It is the observation of some ancient sage whose name I have forgot that passions operate differently on the human mind, as diseases on the body, in proportion to the strength or weakness, soundness or rottenness of the one and the other." Another philosopher, whose name also at present escapes my memory, had somewhere said that resolutions taken in the absence of the beloved object are very apt to vanish in its presence, on both which wise sayings the following chapter may serve as a comment. So mainly in this chapter he is commenting on the passion of love and its different aspects. Fielding describes Joseph's physical charms and comments that this description might include all ladies to bridle their rampant passion for chastity. Continuing with his story, Fielding shows us Lady Booby seemingly scolding Joseph for his conduct, then embarking on another attempt at seduction, but utterly confounded by Joseph's sense of virtue. A reference by Joseph to the chastity of his sister Pamela completely undoes Lady Booby. She then dismisses Joseph from her household and, more mortified than ever, rings violently for Slipslop again, who has been listening at the keyhole. So again, finally, she dismisses Joseph Andrews. Lady Booby instructs Slipslop to see that Joseph is paid off and dismissed, but Slipslop is surprisingly pert in her replies. After a verbal pairing by the ladies, Slipslop remarks, अब देखिए अब quarrel शुरू हो जाता है इन दोनों में, in the lady, that is Lady Booby, and the maid, that is Slipslop. I know what I know. And Lady Booby realizes that her reputation now lies with Slipslop, whom she has just dismissed as well. She tells her steward, Mr. Peter Pounds, to turn Joseph out of the house that evening, but recalls Slipslop to see if she can patch things over. She quickly achieves a reconciliation with Slipslop, but the fact that her reputation is now in the hands of this gossipy servant tortures Lady Booby. Again, you can notice that the theme of affectation, Banawat, the Sanno, is there. Even more disturbing is the maelstrom of emotions concerning Joseph. She is also concerned about Joseph and her emotions for him, because he is not ready to accept. Joseph now understands the full drift of his mistress and unburdens himself in another letter to his sister. Remember, he wrote a letter in chapter 6. He is then called downstairs to receive the small remainder of his wages from the dishonest Peter Pounds. Again, the name Peter Pounds gives us clues towards his dishonesty. Stripped of his uniform that he is wearing, he has to, of course, borrow a frock and breeches from one of the servants. So he leaves the house in borrowed clothes. Although it is 7 o'clock in the evening, the moon is full, so Joseph resolves to begin his journey back to the countryside immediately. It is also important for us as readers to notice that he decides to go back to the countryside. All the effects of the city life that have influenced him so far, as he would start moving towards the countryside, gradually and slowly he would be purified of all those negative influences. Some important points related to chapter 7 are discussed as follows. The mock heroic description of the amorous Mrs. Slipslop as a hungry tigress is an excellent example of Fielding's use of the burlesque in his diction. The larger context of the pursuit of Joseph, however, offers ample illustration of the only source of the true riot, that is affectation. The affectation of Lady Booby is more dangerous than Slipslop's because it involves deceit and hypocrisy. It is important to notice that in a series of leading questions, Lady Booby sounds out Joseph successfully, but just as the simple Parson Adams failed to understand the affected language of Slipslop, so as the straightforward Joseph fails to understand Lady Booby, who interprets his innocence in a completely different by saying that he pretends. So in chapters 6 and 7 you can see that pretension, affectation, vanity and hypocrisy run as the main threads of the themes through the text. The danger of Lady Booby's behavior lies in the very conflict between passion and reason as well. She knows neither herself nor the true nature of Joseph, nor can she put into the principle of self-control. And you can compare this with Joseph Andrews, who exhibited this self-control not only in this episode, in this encounter with Lady Booby, but also physically and mentally showing the same self-control as he handled the horses. Her jealousy of Betty, that is of Lady Booby's jealousy of Betty, the chambermaid, also suggests the jealousy she is to feel when she learns about Fanny. The mortification which Lady Booby feels at the revelation of Joseph's unshakable virtue is a result of her vanity. Above all, she is concerned for her reputation. So she is not concerned about her real virtue. She is not concerned about what actually she does. She is not bothered about her character actually. What she is bothered about is her reputation. She desperately wants Joseph, but only if their affair can be kept as a secret. Her tremendous hypocrisy is exactly what Fielding most scorns, and as a moralist he points it out. To illustrate this, he has mockingly inverted the situation of Richardson's Pamela. Here it is the women who are sexually rampant, and the man, that is Joseph Andrews, is the hero who takes care of his chastity. Further commenting on this chapter, it is important to point out that if there is danger in Lady Booby's deceit, there is nothing more than ostentation in the open pursuit of Joseph by Mrs. Slipslop. Her vanity complements the hypocrisy of Lady Booby. If you remember, at the outset I talked about the main theme of affectation and Fielding's point of view that the main source of ridiculous is affectation, which has two causes, vanity and hypocrisy. So here we can compare and contrast the hypocrisy of Lady Booby with the vanity of Mrs. Slipslop, and between the two of them we have a perfect spectacle of affectation, the source of the true ridiculous. It is ludicrous that such a grotesque cripple as Slipslop should be casting eyes of affection on Joseph. The comedy is emphasized by Slipslop's manner of speaking, just as she thinks herself eminently suited for the handsome Joseph. So she considers her language learned and refined. In reality, her affected speech limps as brokenly as her ugly frame. So this comparison and contrast between the nature and the appearance of the characters is very important for us to understand the theme of affectation. Dear students, with this we move on to the heading of chapter 8, that states, in which after some very fine writing the history goes on and relates the interview between the lady and Joseph, where the latter hath set an example which we despair of seeing followed by his sex in this vicious age. As far as the text of chapter 8 is concerned, here is an example. "Slipslop," said Lady Booby, "when did you see Joseph?" The poor woman, who was so surprised at the unexpected sound of his name at so critical a time that she had the greatest difficulty to conceal the confusion she was under from her mistress, whom she answered nevertheless with pretty good confidence, though not entirely void of fear of suspicion, that she had not seen him that morning. "I am afraid," said Lady Booby, "he is a wild young fellow." "That he is," said Slipslop, "and a wicked one too. To my knowledge he games, drinks, swears and fights eternally. Besides, he is horribly addicted to wenching." "Eh," said the lady, "I never heard that of him." "Oh, madam," answered the other, "he is so lured a rascal that if your ladyship keeps him much longer, you will not have one virgin in your house except myself." Again, her way of grading herself as the only pure soul and the only virtuous character creates laughter here. The text continues, "And yet I can't conceive what the wenches see in him to be so foolishly fond as they are. In my eyes he is as ugly a scarecrow as I ever upheld." "Nay," said the lady, "the boy is well enough." "La, ma'am," cried Slipslop, "I think him the ragmaticalest fellow in the family." "Sure, Slipslop," says she, "you are mistaken, but which of the women do you most suspect?" "Madam," says Slipslop, "there is Betty the chambermaid. I am almost convicted." अब यहाँ वो convinced कहना चाह रही है, "is with child by him." "Eh," says the lady, "then pray pay her wages instantly. I will keep no such sluts in my family. And as for Joseph, you may discard him too." "Would your ladyship have him paid off immediately?" cries Slipslop, "for perhaps when Betty is gone he may mend, and really the boy is a good servant and a strong, healthy, luscious boy enough." Now actually Slipslop, just like Lady Booby, does not want Joseph to go, but she actually presents the case in a different way, and she says that if only Betty is sent away and she is dismissed, maybe there would be chances for Joseph to amend. With this we move on to chapter 9, and the heading of chapter 9 again gives clues about what happens in chapter 9. The text of the heading runs as follows. "What passed between the lady and Mrs. Slipslop, in which we prophesy there are some strokes which everyone will not truly comprehend at the first reading. Slipslop said to the lady, 'I find too much reason.'" And dear students, here is the summary of chapter 9. Lady Booby orders Slipslop, who was listening at the door, to have the steward pay Joseph his wages and send him away. Slipslop opines or gives opinion that if she had known how Lady Booby would react, she would never have reported Joseph's behavior. After sending Slipslop out of the room and then calling her back again, Lady Booby censures her for impertinence, whereupon Slipslop says darkly, "I know what I know," and Lady Booby promptly fires her. अब वो उसको भी नौकरी से निकाल देती है, and Slipslop departs the room, slamming the door behind her. Lady Booby then begins to worry about her reputation, which she perceives is in the hands of Slipslop, who no longer has any incentive to be discreet. After a time, she calls Slipslop back again and reinstates her. She still regrets, however, that her dear reputation was in the power of her servants, both Slipslop and Joseph. Again, the theme of affectation is present here. Her dear reputation. You need to notice how Fielding makes fun of her and her affectation. My dear students, with this we move to the summary of chapter 10. Joseph again writes a letter to his sister. He now understands the drift of his mistress and composes a letter to Pamela, in which he reflects on our lesson of Mr. Adams, that chastity is as great a virtue in a man as in a woman, and attributes his own dedication to virtue to Mr. Adams' guidance and Pamela's letters. he marvels, what fine things are good advice and good example. So actually it is here that Joseph Andrews is working as a mouthpiece of Fielding, who himself believes that good advice and good examples are very fine things. This chapter tells about his departure from London, and after collecting his wages that are paid with much deduction by Lady Booby's steward, Mr. Peter Pounce, Joseph leaves at 7 o'clock in the evening. Well, I think at this point it is important to mention that the 2 letters which Joseph writes to his sister represent one of the novel's last links with Richardson's Pamela. Already Joseph Andrews is developing major themes of its own. That is, the novel Joseph Andrews is developing its own themes. In this section, honesty, self-control and chastity of Joseph predominate. But the theme of true charity emerges in the contrast between the greedy Peter Pounce, who strips of Joseph's uniform, and the generous servant who gives Joseph his own dress. Is a sheer contrast between the pretended charity and true charity. Later acts of charity often center on the metaphor and parable of clothing the naked and needy person. As Joseph leaves London, that is a bad place where there is so little good fellowship that the next door neighbors don't know one another, the epic journey toward the Booby country seat and Joseph's self-knowledge begins in earnest. So his journey back to the countryside would not be a journey only in terms of geographical or physical journey. It would rather be an internal journey as well, a journey of self-knowledge that would start as soon as he would depart Lady Booby's house. My dear students, as I said at the outset of today's session, that in this session we would cover the first 10 chapters of book 1 of our first novel that we would cover in this course, that is Joseph Andrews. So far we have covered first 10 chapters, and as far as the summary of today's session is concerned, we have covered these 10 chapters of book 1 by looking at their headings, by mentioning important summary points and discussing those critical points that enable us understand what these chapters are about. We also explored important text parts with reference to themes, the development of characters and the development of plot as such. Here is a list of the references that are used to create all this. With this, I come to an end of today's session. Thank you very much.